Good morning. We are reading The Wheel on the School by Maynard de Jong. Pictures by Maurice Sendak. And we are in chapter 14, The Tots in the Tower. In the morning, the storm was over. That is, well enough over for the fishermen to go out in the early hours to test the royally lashing sea. All of Shorah was astir. Although it was 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a light in every window. The fishermen were taking no chances. The ebb tide was due at 4 o'clock. If the storm was no longer strong enough to hold the ebb tide water to the dike, their anchored boats would be left high and dry. The wind still blew. The sea still stormed against the dike, but the sound of voices and the clatter of wooden shoes was in the street. Doors slammed. Shouts came from the dike. It was the last-minute excitement of casting off for sea. Wives would not see their husbands again for weeks, while the men in their little fishing boats would be out on the treacherous North Sea. The fishermen wouldn't wait for the storm to calm down still more. If we'd wait for every 2-cent storm, we'd always be sitting on the dike, Yella's father shouted as a farewell when the dinghy left his fishing boat to return to the dike. 3 women rowed it back. This time the dinghy had to be left behind. The sea was too roiled to risk hoisting it on board the boat of Yella's father to serve as a lifeboat for the little fishing fleet. The children had slept through all the turmoil of the preparation and departure. They woke up at their usual school time to find that their homes in the village had gone back to the normal pattern of life. No fathers, just mothers and their children. It seemed very natural. Things were back in their groove. But this morning, the departure of the fishermen signified one added and important thing: the end to the storm. Clothes hastily thrown on, breakfast gulped, all the children instinctively did the same thing. Before setting out for school, they raced to the top of the high dike. There they found each other, and there they stood dismayed. The sea still roiled, the waves still leaped. After their first disappointment, the little group on the dike realized there was a difference. As the children of fishermen, they sensed it. The fishing fleet was long since out of sight. It must be far beyond the islands that now appeared as dark masses in the distance and then fell back into the tossing sea again. An old black steamer wallowed and plunged this side of the islands. But here against the dike, the waves were not washing quite so high. The thin licks of the breakers did not hiss and boil as fearfully up the slope of the dike as they had yesterday. The eyes of all the children went to the high scudding clouds far away over the sea. Out there, under the clouds, halfway to the plunging steamer, a sea-eagle was rising and falling on windy currents of air. A sea-eagle. A bird. But where were the gulls? The seashore without gulls seemed wrong. Maybe a sea-eagle could ride the rough winds, but the gulls had not yet returned. The storm had taken them far inland. Then the children heard the great bronze bell in the village tower. It was 8 o'clock. The school teacher was ringing the bell. It was summoning the farm workers round about Shorah home for breakfast. It was the end of their first 4-hour shift. Even the bell sounded different this morning. Under the wind, the peals of the bell sounded solemn and sweet as they lilted over the dike. The children listened. "The storm is over, is almost over." The bell seemed to sing the powerful song with a great promise of hopeful, sunshiny days to come, of great things ahead. But the boys and Lena could stay no longer on the dike. Now it was school time. They were supposed to be at the door of the school when the teacher returned from ringing the tower bell that called the workers home from the fields. The children raced each other down the dike. The clouds scudded far overhead, but the children of Shorah laughed and shouted in the street as they raced each other to school. The teacher left the heavy iron door at the foot of the tower wide open. He didn't have to close it now against the raw gusts of salty wind and the spray that had leaped the dike these many days. He tugged at the bell rope and looked out the open door. The crisp, clean look of the wind-swept village square held his attention. The storm was going over. The air was fresh again. He rang the bell harder. The great tower filled with the solemn hum of the bell. He stopped at last. Slowly the echoes of the bell seeped out of the big stone room. Then the tower was silent except for the loud ticking of the huge clock in the loft far above him. The teacher stood listening to the ticking of the clock. To his expert ear, the sound was not right, a little off beat. He bit his lower lip in vexation, remembering that he hadn't wound the clock all the days of the storm. He realized he had let it go too long. If he didn't climb up now and wind the clock, it would stop in an hour or so. He looked out the door. The children were gone from the dike. They'd be waiting for him at the school. Well, they'd have to wait a little longer while he climbed to the loft and wound the clock. Waiting for school to open must be one thing a child could be patient about. Maybe the only thing. The teacher started climbing the first long ladder. As he crossed over the floor of the first loft to the next ladder, he heard the voices of children in the square below the tower, the smaller children, with tiny shrill voices. The mothers must have got the small fry out of the houses almost as soon as the school children. Down below, the teacher had left the iron door to the tower wide open. The gate to the churchyard around the tower stood open. Linda, Lena's little sister, had found Jan, Alka's little brother. Jan was her special little playmate. Linda had a great plan. She and Jan were going to make a daisy chain. She had seen her sister Lena do it. It was easy. Other small children were playing in the village square before the churchyard. They wanted Linda and Jan to come, but Linda and Jan were going to make a daisy chain. Jan didn't know what a daisy chain was, but Linda would show him. "Come on, Jan." She went through the gate into the churchyard. She had never been there alone before. Always the gate was closed. Somehow what she was doing seemed forbidden, a little bit wrong. "Come on, Jan." Jan obediently followed her through the gate. They found 2 daisies behind the first gravestone and crouched down to pick them. Hidden by the stone, they were immediately forgotten by the other little children in the square in the excitement of their own play. Linda found 3 more half-open daisies. They wandered on toward the tower. Jan was the first to see that the tower door stood wide open. It intrigued him. It was much more interesting than daisies, and they needed, 100, Linda had said. Jan had no idea what 100 was, but it sounded like a pailful. Jan tiptoed into the tower. Immediately, the silence and the gloom of the cold, ancient stone room frightened him. He ran on. He ran out. "Come on, Linda. Look in here. Oh, it's big." With 5 daisies clutched in her hand, Linda came. Side by side, they went into the tower. They stopped before the bell rope, awed and a little scared. But the outer door stood wide open, and there was light from the doorway. The comforting sounds of the other children playing in the windy square came to them. Along one side of the stone room was a cage with bars. It intrigued Linda. There was an old bare cot in the back of the cage. It was suspended from the wall by 2 heavy chains. Suddenly, Linda remembered, this was the jail where they put bad men. She told Jan. They both breathed heavily. But outside, the other children were yelling nice and loud, and through the open door they could see the dike. "Sometimes when I'm real bad, my mother says that she's going to put me in there," Jan whispered. "She won't, though, will she?" "Oh, no," Linda assured him, her lips quivering. She knew the same threat only too well. They retreated farther from the bars. There was a noise above them. Linda looked toward it. Up the shaft of dim light, with the many ladders going up into the tower, Linda saw legs coming down the ladder. "Look, Jan." Now footsteps were right overhead. A little dust sifted down in their upturned faces. Then the legs were thrust through the trapdoor opening into the big stone room. Breathlessly, Linda pulled Jan behind the big iron door. He was so slow. It was the teacher up there. The teacher of Lena and all the older boys was coming down the ladder. An awesome man, high and mighty, and scary to a little girl who did not go to school. Linda put her hand over Jan's mouth. He was so silly he might say things. The door behind which they were hiding pulled away from in front of them. It clanged shut. A key grated in the lock. There was no other sound. There was darkness except for a small, feeble square of light filtering down from the higher lofts in the tower. It fell on the bars of the cage. They were locked in the tower. In the dark stone room with the jail for big, bad men. And the teacher was gone. Jan began to cry. Linda, almost crying herself, tried to comfort him. Jan pushed her away. "I want my mother," he yelled. That unnerved Linda. Right then and there was nothing in the world that she wanted more than her mother. The light filtered down on the bars of the cell. Linda stared at them with big eyes. She swallowed the beginning of a sob. Let's climb up," she urged. "Oh, we can see everything from up there, the houses and even the islands and the sea." She promised Jan all the good things she could think of because she was promising them to herself. She was afraid of the cell and the bars, but she couldn't tell Jan that. Up there in the tower it was light. Up there wouldn't be a cage. Jan did not want to climb. He wanted his mother. Linda pushed him toward the ladder. "I'll climb right up behind you. Then you can't fall," she told him. She kept her eyes turned away from the bars and almost lifted Jan up on the ladder. Jan had to concentrate on spanning the space from rung to rung with his short, fat legs. He couldn't concentrate and cry and want his mother all at the same time. He climbed. Little sobs still came pushing out of him with the effort, but Linda crowded on behind him to get away from the cell and the bars behind her in the dark room. The two tots climbed toward the light. When at last they pulled themselves through the trapdoor opening, there was just a loft with another long rickety ladder. But here there was light. The light streamed through a window-like opening far too high for them to look out. But here there was no cell with bars. They held hands, awed by the stillness and the strangeness of the place. Through the high opening no sound came, no sound now of other children playing in the square. The world and the village seemed far away and gone.